very warm welcome to the keynote sessions of Avani Annual Research Symposium 2021, Normal Ecologies of Adaptation. On behalf of Avani Symposium and the Avani family, I kindly invite architect R. Kiran Kumar to moderate the session. Kiran Kumar is an architect based in Mysore, currently teaching as Associate Professor at WCFA Mysore. Kiran is an architect. Kiran is a graduate from USD Mysore and postgraduate in theory and design from CEPT Ahmedabad. He is involved in teaching drawing, theory, and design subjects. Architect Kiran is inclined towards understanding architecture through creative drawing methods and architectural ideas, particularly which are holistic in nature. I kindly invite Kiran to moderate the session.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah. Hi all. Happy Teachers Day. Welcome to the Sunday afternoon session. I'll just read out the afternoon session's sort of brief, which has been given to the speakers. It's titled Design, Pedagogy and Practice, Bracing for Uncertainty. The unfolding effects of the current global pandemic has presented its myriad new and unprecedented pedagogical challenges. Design, pedagogy, and remote learning is quite unthinkable for a professional that typically thrives on the interactive, vibrant social and physical encounter engagement with its environment. This emergent crisis has exposed institutional cracks such as educational inequities and systematic injustice among the learning community. The least privileged, most marginalized bearing the brunt. What is an inclusive and accessible pedagogy for design education? How can design practice and pedagogy respond to these recurring pauses? What are the new pedagogical topographies of care, compassion, collaboration, and connectedness? What is the future of design practice in the face of looming uncertainties and long haul of recurring pauses? This is the theme for today's afternoon session. It's a privilege to welcome Shubra and Rohan to the event. I look forward for the talk. And here's a quick introduction to both the speakers. Shubra's practice involves designing buildings and teaching architecture, working in environments that engage diverse issues, multiple constituencies, and varying scales, from interior design and architecture to creative urbanism and conservation. With graduate and postgraduate degrees in architecture and a minor in theory and criticism from Cornell and CEPT universities, she founded Shubra Raje Built Environments, an architecture and design studio that concerns itself with relevant design, architectural economy, and spatial ecology. Shubra is a visiting professor at CEPT. In addition, she has taught at her graduate alma mater, Cornell University, and the Denver and Boulder campuses of the University of Colorado. She lectures, conducts workshops internationally, and serves on the boards of various community arts organizations in Colorado and in India. She is a founding member of Anantaraje Foundation, created as an archive as well as a platform to support cross-disciplinary initiatives in the field of art, architecture, and built environment. Welcome, Shubra, to the event.
Thanks. Hi, everyone.
Kumar is an architect, urban designer, and filmmaker practicing in Mumbai. He is the Dean of Architecture course at Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies. His work engages from architecture, urban research, and consultancy projects to works in film and visual art. He is interested in issues concerning housing, public space, and in exploring the many ways of reading and representing the city. Rohan is the co-editor of publication of an interdisciplinary research and art collaboration project, Cinema City. He also curates film programs and writes on cinema, architecture and urban issues. He's also made films on art, architecture and urbanism, including Nostalgia for the Future, Lovely Villa, and Squeeze the Line in Your Eye. Yeah. Rohan, welcome to the event. We look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Kiran, for that introduction. And I'll start my lecture soon. I need to share the screen, so just hold on. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes, Rohan. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And hello, everyone, again, and happy Teachers' Day. It is a pleasure to be part of this seminar and have the opportunity to meditate on so many things that have been going through my mind over the past year. As was mentioned in my bio, I am an architect and a filmmaker, and I'm interested in questions of representation and the transformations that they make in the world. In other words, perhaps I'm interested in the dialectical relationship between representation and being present. I spend most of my days as a teacher of architecture at a school in the city of Mumbai, a city whose experience is always oscillating between being and becoming. No place in the city is not overlaid with mythologies and histories that we have seen on screen, read in books, or heard about in Hindi film songs. These images and imaginations haunt the streets, the neighborhoods, the public spaces, and even the homes. The landscape of the city is rife with these speculative imaginations. The city is in some way a spectacle, but it's also a presence. And these two are intricately intertwined until we don't know where one begins and the other ends. I speak of the city because I believe it may be the experience of these spaces that led me to think of the world in certain ways. Perhaps my imaginations of good, bad, beautiful, and ugly emerged as I learned from these presences. It is this connection that I'm hoping to explore in this talk, the relationship between presence and learning, especially in the new realities that we've been living in over the past year. How do imaginations of being and becoming intersect with each other? After all, as teachers, our role is to provide the frameworks within which students become architects. In order to be an architect, one must become one, and we provide the scaffolding to enable this transformation. But let us now turn to this past year. The world seems to stand in some way irrevocably transformed. Recalling apocalypses in Hollywood films, an invisible virus stalks the streets. Fear drove us back into our shells, and we treated the outside and consequently the other as a potential carrier of a virus. We shied away from their presence, and with that, we retreated into the perceived safety of our homes. This great retreat decimated the idea of the public as a space for democratic encounters between differences, and furthered the increasing isolation and separation of classes and religions. We grew suspicious of each other. The plague brought out the worst in many of us. We saw the callousness of the state at the desperation of migrant labor as it trudged back across the country. The blame game between the powerful, the cynical photo opportunities, the denials, the doctoring of data. We grew more cynical, less caring, or so we often felt. Yet on the other hand, there was also an outpouring of support for those who were grieving. We found new communities of care. When the state failed to rise up to perform its role, we found that ordinary people took on its mandate. The much reviled internet became an infrastructure to build new networks of assistance to those who needed it the most. We found comfort often in places where we least expected it. The internet became a space for the outpouring of our rage, our grief, our compassion, our love, and our hope. It was in this madness, within this turmoil, that we last year had to start thinking about the act of teaching and learning. I teach the third year of architecture at KRVIA. When faced with these questions last year, we thought we had come up with a damn good plan. We put together a project for the 5th semester students at the KRVIA. In this project, we had to acknowledge the fact that every student was inhabiting a very different kind of space across the country. Some came from the city of Mumbai, but lived in varying circumstances. Others lived in villages in rural Maharashtra with intermittent and almost sometimes no access to the internet, while others lived in small towns across the country. We had to find a way of developing a project that could engage with all these different realities and also enable the studio to engage critically with questions in each. We arrived upon a project that we thought was able to do that. A book inspired the project, this one. This is a manga that is called The Walking Man by Jiro Taniguchi. The book follows an unnamed man through a series of walks in contemporary Tokyo. As he walks the streets with his dog, he encounters people, images, and sounds of everyday life. A group of schoolgirls gossiping, an old woman trying to cross the street, the sight of an airplane above him. There is no conclusion to any of these stories. Every walk is individual and unique to its context, yet somehow the same walk can probably happen in any part of the world. Through our vicarious identification with the man who walks, we are able to see the world around us anew. New narratives emerge around us. We thought that this might be an interesting way to get students to enter their own neighborhoods. So what we did is that we picked 3 fragments of space-time from the comic book, effectively 3 images picked at random. Once dislocated, The image was autonomous from the specific meaning within the walking man, narratively, spatially, and temporally. It was now free to take on new associations. Every student was then asked to find those images within their own neighborhoods. Once found, the students then wrote a narrative, zoomed out spatially and temporally to write a story around the image that came from their surroundings. A conversation of sorts was culled between the student and her context. Characters emerged, their histories and desires for the future mapped and understood. There was a close attention also being paid to the texture and the phenomenology of everyday life. This then became the basis for the design project that they developed, a learning environment for their neighborhoods. Along the way, we tried to evolve ways of communicating and interacting that would exploit the potential of the digital, Miro boards, chat rooms, thinking boards, everything that we all have been doing for the past year. We thought in some way we had managed to be relatively successful. The students were engaged with their sites. They were able to bring insights that maybe would have been impossible in other ways. We don't know. So we were in some ways fairly happy with it. However, there was something going on that we did not at that time seem to acknowledge. In our attempt to make this sort of pedagogic machine that could span the varying geographies within the studio, we did not know that we were also curtailing the horizon of what the student could be and the student could become. When every student brought their own homes and neighborhoods to the table for a discussion, when they laid out their identities in some way for all to see, suddenly their identities were marked by their geographies and their histories. A simple request, please turn your camera on, merely to be able to see the faces of those we speak to, reveal the rooms in which they access the classroom. These were now available for all to see. The girl from a bungalow in the civil lines of Allahabad displayed a home right beside the boy from the tribal district of Gadchiroli in Maharashtra and the boy who came from the slum in Mumbai. In the space of the physical, or I like to call it the analog school, these identities were further away. We did not know them, and often the students chose not to perform those identities. They used the school in some way to dawn a new identity, someone they wanted to be. The school was a space for reinvention, a becoming. With the design of the studio that we had just showed you, we had curtailed, I felt, those horizons of becoming. So the studio forced us to rethink our methods and tools and to start thinking about what does the new affectivity of the digital and the physical enable and disable. What kind of learnings can emerge from this interstice? Not merely as tools of design or mediums of communication, but the mediated reality itself as a way of being in the world. Serendipitously, when Bijoy gave me a call a little over 2 weeks ago, to invite me to speak at this symposium, I was reading a tiny little enigmatic book that was called Heidegger's Hut. It was a study of the mountain home that the philosopher spent a lot of his time living and writing in. Heidegger, as you may all know, was one of the most important philosophers of being. For Heidegger, the concept of Dasein, or being there, was a fundamental feature of being human, being mortal. It is through and within this very being that our imaginations emanate. His writings have been extremely influential, as you know, in shaping the ways in which we think about architecture. His essay, for example, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, makes an explicit difference between the act of making buildings and the more profound act of, let's say, dwelling in it. Inspired by him, Christian Novak Schulz, Kenneth Frampton, Christoph Alexander, and so many more practitioners and theorists have spoken of the importance of place and presence, and how the heightened consciousness of the interlinked relationships of mind, body, and place can be seen as a way to resist the universalization of spatial thinking. Anyway, back to the book I was reading, right? The author was attempting to make a connection between Heidegger's philosophical writings and the space in which he wrote them. In the summer of 1922, Heidegger moved into a small cabin built for him in the Black Forest Mountains. This is a very small building, approximately 6 meters by 7 meters. And here he worked on most of his famous writings. The hut was an essay of sorts in primordial living, 4 rooms around a fire, a pitched roof, and centered around the mundane activities of everyday life: cooking, eating, sleeping, thinking, and writing. Heidegger, in his essay, Why Do I Stay in the Provinces, speaks of this home. He says, "This is my work world. Strictly speaking, I myself never observe the landscape. I experience its hourly changes, day and night, in the great comings and goings of the seasons. The gravity of the mountains and the hardness of their primeval rock, the slow and deliberate growth of the fir trees, the brilliant, simple splendor of the meadows in bloom, the rush of the mountain brook in the long autumn night, the stern simplicity of the flatlands covered with snow, all of this moves and flows through and penetrates daily existence up there. And not in forced moments of aesthetic immersion or artificial empathy, but only when one's existence stands in its work. It is the work alone that opens out the space for the reality that is these mountains. The course of the work remains embedded in what happens in this region. As he says, the hut, in some senses, helped him in shaping his thoughts concerning the world. The architecture of this hut was a cybernetic extension of his body, making a relationship with that world. It was a thinking machine. This romantic imagination of the authenticity and genuineness of the provincial against the perceived corruption and artifice of the city runs through Heidegger's philosophical work. However, this has also been seen as the reason why he was sympathetic to the Nazi cause. After all, their xenophobic ideologies did emerge from a similar call for purity. Perhaps that capitulation itself can be a reason for us to look a little skeptically at the essentializations that lie at the heart of this argument. As a queer man, I can only be more than a little suspicious of these ideas of an essentialized identity. These imaginations can create violences that can be debilitating and destructive on many of us that don't fit easily into the slots that society imagines as the true identity of man, woman, hetero, homo. Identity is not that simple. We inhabit so many at the same time: mother, daughter, sister, woman, lover, friend, doctor. Our identities spiral into a kaleidoscope of categories that very rarely overlap. Some of these identities wage a war against the other, and we are caught up in that game of one-upmanship. To argue for one essential identity is to deny so many of the others. Yet we seem to be able to navigate these differences usually without any compunction. In fact, in many ways, we play with and within them. In his essay, Structure, Sign and Play, Derrida calls this play the disruption of presence. He insists that there is no experience consisting of pure presence, but only a chain of differential marks. In the performance of our lives, identities get resolved, because if they don't, we could end up neurotic or psychotic. For Judith Butler, our identities only exist as performances, and we can play with these performances to construct, dawn, problematize, pretend, and reconfigure ourselves. Identity construction in these ways is political. It allows us to create community and build alliances. Let us now circle back to the beginning of this talk, where we made that very simple assertion. To be an architect, one must become an architect. To be an architect in some ways is an identity that we have to don. Mandated by society as a role to play in the world, there is a worldview and ethics, vanities and presumptions, skills and practices that we have to perform, we have to become. What is this idea of becoming, and what is its relationship to identity, to being? Can one really separate them? Is the self essentially one thing, and does it have a trajectory of desire of becoming that is so simple and unidirectional? For Deleuze, becoming is always double. That which one becomes no less than the one that becomes, essentially mobile, never in equilibrium. The territory of identity, therefore, is always being deterritorialized and reconfigured by desire and by memory. These vectors become trajectories of becoming. And technologies, in some way, enable us to become. They are prosthetics that we wear on our bodies to extend our senses and our abilities. As Donna Haraway has pointed out in her Cyborg Manifesto, we have always had machines to enable ourselves in the world. Or we have always been cyborgs. The machines through we extend ourselves in the world may or may not be material in nature. They may be systemic or organizational. But these machines have allowed us to collapse the gap between being and becoming. Heidegger's hut was one such machine. The internet is also such a machine. It has the ability to collapse space and time. It has the ability to allow us to invent new selves. It can bring us closer to each other, but it can also create walls between us. We can choose to show or not show, see or not see, listen or not listen, speak or not speak. We perform all kinds of identities on the internet. We make avatars, we don masks, we create alliances, new modes of performing ourselves. These can be powerful ways of inventing ourselves or reinventing ourselves, but can also be extremely alienating. The internet enables these performances and actually revels in them. As we perform our identities, they are mapped by multinational conglomerates following our likes, our website preferences, the time we spend on each page on Instagram or Facebook. We seem to become a series of data points. Even our, let's say, futile acts of resistance are incorporated into big data crunching machines. Technophiliacs embrace this disintegration of presence with glee. They revel in it and the possibilities it affords. Tomes have been written about the replacement of real presence with the digital. However, we still do eat, sleep, drink, shit in the mundane and the tangible world. This world is not yet been erased. And this is the domain of architecture, at least as we know of it for now. Let us now consider the specific ways in which the role of the architect is conceived and what is the nature of this domain. What is this expertise meant to be? And consequently, what are the ways in which we as teachers can imagine the structuring the vector of sorts of becoming an architect. The unique domain of architecture is space, or rather the structuring of space into place, giving presence or value to a location. As such, it is deeply enmeshed in phenomenological experiences, even when it might appear that some universalizing mathematical or logical models are at the base of it. It has to finally emerge at a specific intersection of body, space, and time, at a place, in other words, in an occasion. It cannot escape it. We have seen how the idea of being and its relationship with thought was imagined by Heidegger and became a way in which it shaped his philosophy. For us as architects, whose very mandate involves the making of experience, these have been important learnings. We have to acknowledge the consideration of the phenomenology of place as part of the professional mandate and consequently as the pedagogic object of inquiry. And as teachers of architecture, then, we are interested in the trajectories of identity formation as we choreograph them towards becoming architect. This is a process, as we all say this very often, that one does not stop learning as an architect. The identity marker of the architect then is a direction, a vector that continues endlessly outward, remaking the self. Or as Derrida puts it, we are always still to be invented. As teachers, our role seems to be giving a direction to that vector of invention. If one is to also think about Heidegger's assertion that to be in the world is where the relationship between thought and experience cannot be separated, but are in fact, in some ways deeply embedded within each other, we have to start problematizing the mind-body dualism, sometimes so deeply embedded in the way we speak about teaching. To be an architect, after all, is an act of performing in the world, and in acts of performance, the mind and the body act as one being. This is acknowledged when we think about embodied learning practices, like in the learning of bicycling or swimming. We don't learn either by first learning the concepts of bicycling and then beginning to demonstrate them on a bicycle. We learn by practicing, by getting on the bicycle and failing and falling over and over again until we gradually become more confident and maybe also proficient. In some ways, through riyaz, we strive towards perfection, even if we never get there. If indeed architecture is an act of performance in the world, then embodied learning is essential in the way that we train the student. This is already deeply embedded within the structure of architectural pedagogy. The workshop and the studio are spaces where the student learns through performing the act of architecture itself. The space of the studio becomes a space for rehearsal. If one pushes the metaphor further, one then has to examine the relationship between the space of the studio or the rehearsal space and that of the quote-unquote real world with real world consequences. How do we create within the space of the studio simulations of the real? What are the parameters that are set up by the studio to enable the student to perform the identity of the architect? We must remember that this identity is also not singular. It also emerges in the act of play with the other identities one inhabits. If we agree that within the studio space, we make a safe space of sorts for rehearsing action, we have to be conscious of the nature of the space and the role play that we construct. These role plays are like, people wearing masks in a masquerade. The mask is an extraordinarily powerful machine, I believe, of becoming. We conceal and we reveal simultaneously. What masquerade do we choreograph within the studio for the students to play act future action? Or what masks do we ask them to wear? I'm speaking as if the teacher in this case is a neutral actor in this game, but as you know, the act of teaching is as much a performance. We wear masks too. It is important to acknowledge then that the studio itself is a space of collective learning and conversation. Bell Hooks describes teaching as a performative act and teachers as catalysts that invite everyone to become more engaged and activated. The performative aspects of learning, she says, offers the space for change, invention, spontaneous shifts that can serve as a catalyst, drawing out the unique elements in each classroom. The studio, in other words, is the machine that directs desire. For architecture, the driver of that machine must be hope. This hope is riddled with democratic ambitions, ecological sensitivities, a sense of time and history, and most importantly, love. Love of the world and love of each other. Architecture, after all, is meant to be, in many ways generous, giving. It is called a service. The space of the design studio must be conscious of the notion of rehearsals. Projects are written as a series of questions within a domain. These form frameworks within which the student scripts her own narrative, bringing not only her own predilections to the table, but also her aspirations and desires. These are shaped by the experience of the world, by encountering the other, and meditating about the consequences of acting in the world. The student is then asked to struggle with these choices and arrive upon her own position and proposition through a dialectic between the poles of thought and action, concept and resolution, between the concrete and the abstract. The space in between these is kept uncertain, and this can be very productive in allowing for a space of discovery. Can we imagine then that the architecture is not in itself about buildings, but about the process or the act of building, the process through which we engage with the world towards making it better, capital B. Then the roles that we perform can also be different. Far from the machismo of the egomania of the creative genius auteur, we can start thinking about collaborative, maybe gentler ways of engaging with the field of architecture. The masquerade, if designed well, can enable new modes of practice to emerge. And in this masquerade, maybe the digital can help. Because, the digital world enables us to perform multiple new identities. It expands the horizons of who we can be and become. We can choose our own avatars, our Zoom backgrounds, who we are with, where we want to be seen. At the click of a button, we can access knowledge from around the world. Digital technology can isolate us in echo chambers where we can only meet mirrors of ourselves and rail against those we disagree. Far from being the democratic and free space it was promised to be, it can also be a violent and dangerous terrain. However, in the world that we are living in now, this is inescapable. Although it can, swallow us whole until it is believed that the old-fashioned Heideggerian presence becomes a relic of the past, yet this idea of presence continues to haunt us. Our bodies have not yet become, ether. Even after the virus is gone, we will continue to exist as cybernetic beings. What will this mean when these cyborgs want to make architecture? Isn't architecture also a machine, an extension of our bodies, the ultimate machine for living? And doesn't that machine and its affect enable us to think of the world in particular ways, like Heidegger's hut? What are these new imaginations that are enabled by the digital thinking machine? With the virtual woven through the very fabric of our everyday lives, where does one machine begin and the other end? If hope is the primary driver of the architectural engine, what can the future of pedagogic practice be and become? How does one create the uncertainty? And this is a difficult one. How does one create the uncertainty necessary for any act of learning when there is shelter and comfort all around you in the familiar? How can one make an argument for danger as a catalyst for growth and learning? How does one learn empathy and compassion when the only interface between you and the other is a screen? How can we, in the space of the studio, choreograph masquerades? What are the masks that we choose to get students and faculty to wear to enable performances that are able to mediate between the digital and the analog? Can we engage proactively with these new dimensions of being and becoming? Does it in some way reconfigure entirely what it means to be an architect? And of course, naturally, does it also reform entirely what we call architecture? In a playful inversion of Corbusier's dictum of the home being the machine for living, if indeed the machine is and has always been the home that we live in, what does this mean for us and our being cyborgs, being architects? Well, that's it from me, I think. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak here. It's a privilege, and I'm hoping for a great conversation afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rohan, for the wonderful talk and a lot of things to sink in to ask questions before. Thanks a lot. I invite Shubra to present.
Yeah, before I start sharing my screen again, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with everyone. As I was talking about before, yesterday's sessions had such an intimacy to them, regardless of how far we are from each other. So I think I was very excited by that, because I think that kind of an intimacy sometimes is hard to get by. It felt like we were all actually talking to one another. Thank you, Rohan, as well. It was a brilliantly stimulating talk, and I really hope I can enter the conversation rather than just sort of come now, stand and say my piece. So I'll try and modify a few things during my presentation, almost as in trying to do a little bit of Jugabandi, but hopefully at the end in the conversation we can continue. So with that, I'm going to start sharing. So I think I'm going to start with where we all, generally find ourselves every day. I started the year 2020 with sort of a business as usual attitude to work. I identified myself as someone immersed in one's work. And my notion of work I didn't question before. I thought revolving around my profession, my practice, work as as something of an effort in order to achieve something, and also that something which is achieved, both constituted work. Buildings, drawings, sketches, proposals, positions, hypotheses, teaching, blah, blah. And then we obviously Corona came around. We met this virus and all its consequences, and my work suddenly got buried within a lot of other things that sort of enveloped my work and sort of became this larger world, and pretty damn drastically. And after perhaps a month or so of sheer repetition, my goodness, it was numbing. And I finally began to understand, what Merrill Lederman Euclides, one of my, the 60s artists were really quite interesting, because they're kind of trying to rethink their situations. And she was someone who, look her up, she did what was called maintenance art. But I finally began to really understand with my body and my frustration what she meant when she said that she felt her entitled and education little brain go, so long, I'm leaving now. I wasn't cut out for this. I have to do something new. That is exactly how I was feeling. I was sort of like, because our education, you see, teaches us not to repeat, but to move forward. Like the frontiersman, and the great American myth, always moving into the unknown. That is progress. That is learning. That is not stagnating, etc. Instead, I felt tied down with my freedom to move and act, seemingly trapped within the endless monotony of this repetition, just to maintain my survival and the survival of my immediate environment and my family and of my shelter. And there was no choice in this. You had to do it. But a shift was occurring, you see, because once, your body and your mind begins to sort of truly, the routine starts getting into you, you begin to get in sync with this routine. Suddenly new avenues begin emerging. And I realized that I myself unknowingly began to do whatever was necessary to enable my brain to thrive, rather than, simply put, how long can you keep complaining? You don't like yourself, nobody else likes you. So anyway, the mind starts clicking into other gears given your context. And I began to notice maintenance systems around me, daily, weekly, or seasonal cycles responding to place, in Ahmedabad's case, the dustiness, the time as well, and climate. The lady to the right of the screen looking out of the window, she opens and closes her window system every day. Rohan mentioned houses as machines. recalling Corb. Well, and the machines need to constantly be operated, otherwise, you know, the battery goes down, so to speak, of the car. So she sort of closes the mid-height windows at 10 o'clock in the morning, only leaves the top one open so that cross ventilation is maintained. At night, you open the lower one so that colder air comes through and, you know, sort of makes you comfortable if you're sleeping on the floor, etc. As a device. The lady in the center, of course, is cleaning her car, yay to her. And the lady seems like a lady to the left, sweeping the street. And then at the end, after the sweeping is finished, probably doing a little kolam or something as a marker for that day, the end of that chore, moving on to the next one, I suppose. And also, one, that maintenance cycles were calibrated to the context in terms of their frequency, in terms of, so an extremely dusty place probably requires sweeping and mopping every day, but maybe if you're in Bombay, may not be. And also I began to get reminded that maintenance is forever. Maintenance is universal and it's forever. There is no starting and finishing. It's an enduring practice in that sense. And the very, very opposite of timelessness, in that it requires our presence. We don't transcend anything. We are always yanked back into the presence. And so it is a practice and a mode of engagement which helps cultivate a sensibility that allows one to discover the unknown, the mythologized, and the paradoxical in the familiar, because of the intimacy and the proximity and the frequency with it. You just don't have a choice. But the intimacy and the proximity is not a choice, but what you do with it becomes then that tool of empowerment. Maintenance approached in this manner problematizes creativity as well, where creativity now is not necessarily merely the perpetual pursuit of the new, a linear trajectory, but as the imaginative re-examination of what we take for granted, especially in terms of practice, the dominant mythologies of our profession. An examination that must deal with the specificities of context and how to make it relevant to the design practice and the way we think about architecture. So actually, let's start at the finish. You know, that disciplinary threshold, unquestioned and actually enshrined through our guild-endorsed contracts, you know, the completion, when a project is completed. With regards to an architectural practice, I begin to think then about our expectations of what constitutes finished, whether time decays from day one as we move towards an arbitrary finish line, dates of completion and so on, and whether the project is enriched by time. So with that, I'll come to one of three sort of experiences that I'm going to share in the spirit of what Professor Chaya yesterday talked about in terms of the house, the home, not being an enclosure, but sort of this entanglement, the coming together momentarily of various sort of strand lines, I think he called, of movement, that I'm choosing to look at the work, not as something that I have produced, but as something I have passed through and can do so again. And it is with that spirit that I also offer it to this conversation. So this one is this notion, go back to this time thing, to be able to feel the age in something. These have defined the trajectory of the conservation and rehabilitation of a 5,000-year-old funerary structure called the Shune al-Zabib in Abydos, Egypt. Abydos is very close to Luxor and Karnak, where I was part of the archaeological and conservation team under the aegis of UPenn, Yale, and the Institute of Fine Arts. It was a largish team of 20 people. Now, this photograph shows one part of its location. These maps show another part. They show where the structure is located and sited, both in its physical as well as historic context. So the plan on the right shows our Shune in the presence of previous structures that make up this little complex. All the previous structures are actually under the sand, excavated and reburied. So the only structure that stands is our little shune. Actually, rather big shune, but yeah. What happens is that drawing that I showed, or that photograph, is not enough. The shune, you see, has another aspect, another dimension to it, which is that it has been the bearer of multiple histories and multiple cultural uses, reuses, and abuses that continue. And all three are kind of interlocked, really. The first one, of course, if you want to talk about it, kind of why it was built, the original intent, which sometimes becomes overriding in our discipline, especially the silo of conservation. That intent is very important to restore something. Well, that was, as I said, 5,000 years ago. It was this pharaoh called Khasi-Khemri. This was his funerary enclosure. This enclosure was pre-pyramid. Khasi-Khemri was Zoser of the stepped pyramid fame at Saqqara, his dad. So there were no pyramids up to then. Zoser was the first guy who built the pyramid. Anyway, so this lasted only 50 years, after which, because he died, probably poisoned or murdered. Anyway, so then the structure fell into disrepair because he was embalmed and tombed, and the purpose of the structure was, in a sense, gone, the original. But the shune continued through its presence to offer itself up to other uses. In about 300 AD, you had Coptic monks fleeing persecution, coming across the Mediterranean, going south rather than the current north, and started carving into this massive funerary enclosure, which is almost like, guys, it's like 15 feet wide because it's a pure gravity structure. Imagine a wall being 15 feet wide. So these guys came, carved little cells into the enclosure. Then you started having post rise of Islam. Nobody, again, the peaks and falls, so nobody knew what the shune was about. And yet it had a sort of an occult presence. So you started having these burials around its foundations. And because people started digging around its foundation, another period of little instability, little foundation moving, little collapses, but also it continued to be relevant in its own way. Then you had, it played a role around the 1800s with the rise of Napoleon and expansion, the colonies. Egyptology began to come into play. And Egyptology was actually a fairly invasive discipline, you know, because in the early days, they were all just concerned with finding sexy tombs and sexy treasures. So they would dig up and not fill back. Again, parts of the shune started falling and the form, so to speak, started changing. So that left its mark as well. And the present times where you have settlements around the shune, agriculture around the shune, that brings with it an entire different ecosystem of insects and termites, and then birds, and then foxes eating the birds, and all of them making their home in the shune, and the shune continues to evolve. So all that is to say that the goal of the conservation was one where the whole sort of effort was to acknowledge and maintain these multiple histories and the cultural reuse of the shune, to preserve the structure as a ruin, so to speak, which itself resulted in a record of its long life on the ever-changing landscape of Abydos, and ultimately maintaining a tangible connection to the antiquities that echo throughout history. New material, therefore, was to be limited to where necessary to just stabilize existing walls. This shows an axonometric, for instance, where we evaluated major structural cracks at the shune, the inner wall. Initial evaluation and establishment of guidelines happened. This was way back in 2000. Treatment specifications came about in 2001, and then actual stabilization work began in 2004. It's still ongoing. You get the idea that, you know, it's every season, every year. It's an ongoing thing now. And it also, because it's a seasonal effort, the Guftis, who are actually, they have an ancestral connection to Egyptologists, their team and the team of current Egyptologists are constituted every year on the site for 3 months, and then it becomes too hot to work in the desert. Everyone goes to their lives. Many of these Guftis are Masons, and the site becomes a sort of a cultural exchange for archaeological, but also current practices in masonry, etc. And not just one way, because, for instance, Nabil goes to San Francisco every so often in order to sort of work with teams all along California with their mission churches, because they are adobe structures as well. And so therefore what happens is, going back to what you're seeing in this, the dark patches on top are the new sun-dried adobe bricks made on the site with a similar composition to the original, and the strength of both the original and new bricks sort of tying into one another. And they are currently darker because they are wet, but by the next season they dry up in the sun and they become part of the original, and their texture sort of continues to erode because it's the same adobe brick. Therefore, the new, from the time it is installed, is designed to become part of the context, as well as the part of the erosion process of the desert, which you cannot stop. That is the context. And both together continue to shape the Shune. New uses and abuses will undoubtedly continue, tourism being among them, looting, like during 2012 to 2014, during the Arab Spring, that continues to happen as well. And all these will continue to inform and change and recalibrate the Shune's maintenance. Similarly, several years ago, in 2013 to be precise, I became involved in designing a school. That's why I was called, in Central East Asia, in a place called Jharsuguda in Orissa. Now, you know, it's East Orissa, it's West Orissa, not coastal. So think of the dry, crackling jungles, you know, of Bastar and Chhattisgarh, etc., etc. That's your context. But by and large, dry, hot, with periods of monsoons. A very fertile landscape because it's also in the Gangetic Plain, on the surface as well as below, but at the same time also an extractive surface. And an extractive sort of engagement with the context. In such a context, we sort of began looking at the notion of the built mass and how we could carve into it to find space and shadows. Such operations also started making connections to traditional typologies in the Indian subcontinent. You're all familiar with this, you know, dry climatic regions, courtyard houses at various scales abound, as do palaces within forts. So all similar in principle, a tough, hefty exterior to protect against harshness of the climate, the sun, the wind, the dust, the monsoons, the occasional enemy. So what you see is something similar, Jharsuguda being quite polluted as well. And then as you cross the threshold, we're all familiar with this. I'm not saying anything new. A different sensibility takes over, not one of resistance, which is of the exterior, but one of extensions. The composition begins to open up, creating spaces of shade and shadow, rooms without roofs, etc. Of course, so all this, what I've just said, is an expression of the climate. We all know that. We also begin to see that the architecture, clearly there's a blurring of boundaries. Between the enclosed room and the courtyard lies a whole continuum of zones with varying definitions and degrees of protection. The demarcations are easy and amorphous, subtle modulations of light and in the quality of ambient air. And all of these, they register each transition with our senses. We know when we are moving from one zone to the other. All that said, while this formal strategy rightly evokes an archetype like a deep rumbling echo, this was actually not the emphasis when we began. And when the genesis of our process. Instead, we tend to look at the architectural program to provide endurance, which is both material, tangible, and sort of a practice of everyday life. The formal sort of expression that you see came as a result of what I'm just about to now talk to you about. So I see the act of programming as an opportunity of bringing a convivial complicity between activities officially programmed and ones that aren't, such that they need each other's presence, a complicity that engages us in the search for a greater economy of means. At the end of the day, that is what we were looking for. The goal then is to intensify and expand the impact of a limited set of operations, asking less to be more through the interweaving of functional activity and material conditions. What do I mean by all this? That in a school, we typically sort of where efficiency demands, basically one of two diagrams, a single loaded corridor with classrooms, or a double loaded corridor, depending on the climate you're in. But what we did was, by swinging half the diagram around, we began enclosing an outdoor room, scaled to the functional entity of a classroom. So the green you see is actually scaled to one of the classrooms represented in the dark gray. And the non-programmed, in this case, the one you see with the dotted circle, the courtyard, that is to say, ceases to become a symbolic, aesthetic, or technocratic, that is climate responsive entity within the plan, but gets tied to activity. It's our fifth classroom, you know, of that program. A similar attitude applies to another set of classrooms, in this case, a preschool, a slightly different plan, but the idea is the same. And that is how one arrives at the plan and then the form. If we examine one area of the plan further, the entrance lobby, so to speak, of the school, it is, of course, the entrance, but it is also where meals are had, because we encourage kids at this age, actually across the ages, to eat sitting on the floor. So mats are rolled out, food is served, kids take their plates back to the kitchen when they're done and clean up after themselves. After that, perhaps they take a nap if it's a preschool, or maybe a conversation or a classroom. In the monsoon, the play equipment gets temporarily located here. So it reflects and extends an approach that enables the capacity to improvise. The outdoor room and its accessories become the lobby, the dining, the nap area, the play area. It's an indispensable area rather than a leftover area. For us, this is important because it begins to define our ideas around efficiency and, more importantly, endurance. We can't afford to squander, we know this, the kind of resources required, let's say, to air condition buildings. Form follows climate, as KRVIA often used to say, and the building itself, therefore, through its form, creates the controls the user needs. In short, dealing effectively with the context necessitates an inventiveness about living patterns, about activity beyond function. This attitude allows us to be a nomad within the building, using different conditions of the built form. You also end up building less, because instead of 5 classrooms, you can do away with 1 and capture that again as a courtyard. But the point here being that this strategy only works if it is reinforced day in and day out in terms of the manner in which teaching now embraces this attitude, the manner in which the school embraces this attitude, etc. And it is this cycle of activity and acts of remembering and remembering played out day after day that reinforces patterns of living that generate and sustain the culture of a place. And in that sense, it is a maintaining of the culture that is then produced rather than borrowing an archetype just because of some argument about critical regionalism. So that since I evoked this act of activity and practice tied then to plan making, Joseph Brodsky writes that the city of memory is empty because for imagination, it is easier to conjure architecture rather than living things and human beings. But architecture is meaningful only in the interaction and resonance with life, real, remembered, or imagined. And more importantly, we design from what we remember. Inventions do not exist in isolation, and that connection between what we remember, not as nostalgia, but something with which we meet our present context, that is fertile ground. So with that, I come to another example. This now is, so all these things when we practice, the practice almost becomes a way to find out things that then we can take back into the various workshops and classrooms, etc., to explore them further. So in this case, I'm going to be talking about a small exercise that keeps reappearing here and there when we are doing certain workshops as well, although it began in a studio to break a deadlock, actually. And here, what we are saying, continuing from the previous project and the thoughts therein, that if creativity and imagination are not understood as a freedom from the obligations of the everyday, you know, that light bulb aha moment, but in fact are embedded in these obligations, then accessing them, first of all, in our embodied selves, engaging with them and reconstituting embodied knowledge becomes a way to keep the imagination of the everyday alive. So it is not something out there that we observe them doing. It is something that is in us because we are part of the everyday as well, just as conversations around nature. It's like there's no man nature, we are sort of part of the same system. The exercise that I often like to give, mainly as a curiosity, because we talk about the commons and civic space and democracy and accessibility, etc., all the time, you know, in studios. And I often began wondering, what are my students' experiences with the state, really? I mean, do they go pay their own taxes, for instance? Do we still use post offices? Where did we get our Aadhaar card made? What were our experiences with interacting with the state, so to speak, at that everyday level and not just at the central vista or the parliament or some central city square notion of the everyday? So this exercise was really very simple. Students would remember when they got their Aadhaar card. Presumably everyone had to go somewhere to apply for it, and that process was they were asked to remember and document. Of course, this is what everyone comes up with in one shape or form, which is, like we were talking about yesterday, again, enclosures. The line comes first, the demarcation comes first. We modify the exercise, encourage them to actually think of it only in terms of remember and represent only those places which were touched by your feet, so to speak. That means only places you went to. The center might be part of something larger, but you are concentrating with all the energy and rigor and precision you can muster. It might have been 5 years ago, but that is remembering. And prerogating the ground rather than the walls. And then the second layer that came over it was with trace, here of course collapsed for the online medium, with trace, in 15-minute increments, locate yourself in a line, in a jhund, in a group, by yourself. In 15-minute increments, your movement through this remembered center. And, you know, depending on how the experience was, some students, you get the message. Some students waited 3 hours, some waited a whole day, some waited only half an hour, super efficient center. But that stack, almost so to speak, of trace depended really on where they were. And what we began seeing and noticing was that the majority of where the red dot was actually the area of waiting. In this case, this student's case, there was only one 15-minute instant increment, which actually alluded and referred to the act of all the biometrics, blah, blah, being taken. The layer added to that was to expand their understanding now with accessing Google Maps, what that particular experience they mapped out in space and time, and it was important to stretch or to assemble time this way rather than collapse it, what it was a part of. And the last exercise was to do with as few movements as possible to augment the one part which was in a way where well, to augment the other center, but the discussions that followed ended up being that in fact, where should the architecture lie? In the programmed official spaces of where biometrics are taken, etc., and where records are stored, or whether the siting is situated in another condition altogether. That is both a part of the center's activity, but also part of perhaps the rest of the neighborhood when the center is closed. So it became this remembering, became an active manifestation of curiosity in the manner expressed by Foucault, that curiosity is a new vice that has been stigmatized, in his case, Christianity, but even in our cases, you know, curiosity kills the cat, etc. Curiosity is futility, it often is conflated. The word, however, Foucault says, pleases me. To me, it suggests something altogether different. It evokes concern. It evokes the care one takes for what exists and what could exist, a readiness to find strange and singular what surrounds us, a certain relentlessness to break up our familiarities and to regard otherwise the same things, a fervor to grasp what is happening and what passes, a casualness in regards to the traditional hierarchies of the important and the essential. In the student's case, for instance, he suddenly realized that his expertise as an architect would be lent much better to making just a really pleasant waiting area that when the Aadhaar center is shut is sort of offered back to the sidewalk and vice versa. So with that, I think I'd like to end here and perhaps just start the conversation with Rohan, and that what is familiar is what we are used to. What we are used to is the most difficult to know. Another one of these Enlightenment guys, Nietzsche, who said that. But I would argue it is that tangential excitement of knowing anew that momentarily holds us in place, that place of pause that we were talking about yesterday. But that place of pause is, in a sense, that little instance is our project, and our practice is everything on either side of it. And it's this momentarily being held in place that is what maintains our presence and an enduring engagement of our world. Maintenance here, therefore, as a means to find out. Maintenance is research, really, and as a constructive tool. And that begins a practice of critical intimacy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shubra, for the wonderful and brilliant lecture. Yeah, so there's a lot to digest and soak in between the two lectures. I think the job of the moderator is to mediate the pause of soaking both the lectures and keeping people engaged. So what I'm going to do in terms of moderation, I have sort of pre-prepared 3 questions, sort of to mediate the pause and sort of allow people to prepare their question and sort of filter it and post it. Also Teachers' Day, I thought I'll come from sort of a little personal question. So when the lockdown happened, they said 3 weeks you're not in college, and suddenly you said you start teaching from home. And there was a big hesitation on how to do this first lecture. right? And that absurdity of talking to your own laptop for 1 hour, and that recurring question, is anybody listening, is there, and it's there also in a regular class, but then it's still in its more absurd sounds to talking to your own laptop. So I just wanted to talk about that particular phase for both of you. How did you? But I think most of them asking question of what is teaching, and the little change in their compass of direction of teaching. Did you have any hesitation to go online, and what was the early phase like for both of you?
Can I go? I guess. Yeah. For
Yeah.
us, it was very scary. I think I was, first of all, as a teacher, I like moving around. I like gesticulating, and I like my hands are doing most of the teaching. And suddenly I was caught in the screen, in the frame. I couldn't move. I had to look at a certain place. I couldn't move my eyes around. It was suddenly I felt in a strange way like to be in some sort of strange prison. In the beginning. And I was in the beginning. I think all of us were feeling that how does one teach architecture to people, which there's a presumption, or maybe it's an idea that we have, that architecture is very much about the physical.
Yeah.
And you have to, and especially at KRVIA, there's this great emphasis on the site. Like you have to go out there, and you have to speak to people, and you have to draw and all of that stuff. And then now suddenly you're thinking that I can't tell anybody to step outside the house. It's just like putting them in harm's way. So how do you then imagine to teach architecture in a remote way? And that I think it took us some time to figure out how to do that. And that project that I showed was like some sort of attempt to try and do that. But I found out that actually that became a pattern for many studios around the country. Everyone was doing neighborhood projects. Because it was assumed that people could then walk around in their neighborhoods and come up with projects, so that then became a way in which this could happen. But yeah, it was difficult because I think what we had done, we were trying to replicate a certain kind of teaching within a completely different medium. And I think we should have really, I mean, that was the first time we were trying to do this, but I think we could have really thought maybe of new ideas of architecture and design entirely with this new medium. What this new medium could afford us to do is that we could evolve perhaps more collaborative modes of learning, perhaps more networked imaginations of knowledge sharing, which is enabled by this medium, which of course, I don't think we had the imagination at that point to do. I think we were just rushing into into the designing of the semester. And this particular kind of way in which we imagine architectural teaching is actually not compatible with the digital realm. We need to really rethink what that relationship is between architectural training and the digital and this new world that we are living in. I think we're still in that ambiguous phase. That's about it. Yeah. Shubra, over to you.
For me, there were a couple of things happened. As we went digital is also when I started co-teaching, where my friend and colleague Kevin Lowe and I started taking a studio, running a studio at SEPT. And so straight off the bat, what I found myself realizing was I actually like to play with constraints. It feeds my process. And so it was all about an opportunity to rethink these assumptions that for architects, we have to do that first site visit. No? And because there was already a background of certain workshops where we were questioning projects that we were critiquing, projects that were familiar to us, but not necessarily around us, through rediscovering how much we can actually decipher, read from drawings. So straight from off the bat, we started giving projects where on the one hand, we thought we were familiar with them. So IIM Sangat, these became our sites. Because on the one hand, I don't think anybody of the people gathered here will say, oh, I'm not familiar with that project, right? They all have their embodied memories. But we also, the line of argument, and especially very searing critique that Kevin brings, which I wanted to harness in the studio, was, have we studied them? And so it became, one of the methods became a way of really learning everything that's available to us, from the basic drawings published by architects to what can Google give us, what can street views give us, what can photos not taken by us but others give us. And very quickly, Helen Binet, Ivan Bahn, all the other architectural photographers became irrelevant, because they were all showing only one thing: the sensual experience of the site, nothing else. And that was a big learning for me, and I hope for my students. We all take those photographs as well. So we anyway know our projects only in one way. And the limitation presented by not being able to go to the site. So we did not give projects which were in our neighborhoods. We actually gave projects that were common to our collective as a discipline, and said, okay, how much do we know? How much do we actually see? And students said, oh, but we need to visit the site. So we said, okay, after 2 weeks, one representative and the TA will go to the site with your questions, just to clarify or reaffirm certain, if you're feeling uncomfortable. And entire studios unfolded. What we learned from there is, I'm not saying either or. All I'm trying to say is it opened up a portal, and it dismantled an assumption that site visit is the very first thing we do. Because what happens, and storytellers and theater makers will attest to this, sometimes the physical experience of the site overwhelms certain connections, especially because as architects, we are so visually trained. It completely overwhelms, like floodwaters, the other subtle relationships that exist. Anyway, so that's one thing we did. So it was, and the second was this idea of remembering. So memory not as nostalgia, memory as an act, and your body and your vessel and your embodied knowledge becoming relevant to the study, and not what somebody else said, but in service of augmentation of whatever project we had, not as a creative island from which we can sort of, pardon my word, but masturbate with our own creativity. You know, it was in that sense. So I actually have found this 18 months and all the fortunate and unfortunate circumstances that happened, the absolutely essential component of co-tutoring, all that began to sort of shift the landscapes and allowed me to learn once again and question some of the assumptions we work with. Now, of course, which is what we were talking about earlier, re-entering the familiar world will now require a similar process of understanding the instrumentality of a, even if it's the same or it's not the same, evaluating the context in terms of our present and what is, it's like, you know, the first time I went out in my car after the first big lockdown, and I remember laughing and saying, oh, the city still exists, because it was, you know, so that way, what is our context now is the next year that will follow, you know, seeing what has shifted, what has not. So it was never a question of trying to replicate something, because I couldn't do so anyway. The fright, the scare that I had was to do with things I didn't know, which is all tech oriented. What if the internet goes away? What will happen to my studio session that day? You know, things like that. What if I don't know how to share screen, nothing is happening. My thoughts are getting interrupted by me trying to navigate technologically, annotate, can you see, ma'am, I can't see your annotation, blah, blah. So it was all to do with things that I was becoming familiar with that I never had to. It was like learning a new language. But that itself is a place of, I think Deepta yesterday mentioned, no? With vulnerability comes an ability of the mind to, oh my God, learn at like warp speed. So that happened. But I think the more fun discovery and the more important learning was some of our deepest assumptions that we start off, whether it's our project or whether it's our whether it's the project of teaching or whether it's a project of building, making, etc. Our basic assumptions were ripe to be questioned. Yeah.
Thank you. So I was relating to the word you had used to discuss about the school, how with certain operative moves you had to do something more, right? Even it's like you had to do for not for studios maybe, but for like subjects like drawing, where you're teaching a day of drawing. When you're not there in the studio, how do you teach drawing, right? So you have to make certain sharp moves so that it can keep them engaged in a day and things like that. So that's I want to move from there. This is one point I've picked between both lectures. Consciously, but Shubra didn't use the word Riyaz, but I'm going to make that connection. And I'm going to read a little from, I just connected with something I read recently from Amit Chaudhary's book. It's called Finding the Raga, an improvisation of Indian music. And one sentence struck me. It says, Riyaz is the most secret part of yourself, the time you share with no one. I found that sentence really interesting. And I'm just going to take the liberty to read a paragraph to give the context, because it's relating how we do on your own in the digital time. Riya performance needn't be creative, it is self-imposed. But it shares with aesthetic production a kind of selflessness of investment. You do it to survive as an artist, independent of the appreciation you may or may not get. And just to continue another interesting sentence, the Sanskrit precursor of Riyaz would be sadhana, which refers to a long-term, perhaps lifelong discipline whose end is not a well-defined goal, but the pursuit of sadhana itself. In that sense, sadhana doesn't make a clear distinction between labor and its fruit, between preparation and performance. Just to sort of tag on Rohan's word of performance there, preparation and performance. Sadhana, unlike Riyaz, isn't a music-specific word. It could be used for football or of living life itself. So I just want to sort of make the question broader. Again, going back to the first sentence I read, the Riyaz is the most secret part of yourself, the time you share with no one. My reading is digital time has allowed us to be engaged with this sort of Riyaz a little more on your own, because maybe the studio may be sometime overwhelming, and the digital time could give you some space to do this. You want to reflect upon Riyaz or sadhana, both of you, and you want to add something to this repetition and in the digital time?
I think Shubra spoke quite a bit about the idea of repetitive kinds of imaginations of how the cycles of everyday life become, after you kind of, your body gets sort of accustomed to being able to, it just becomes your body and it's a way of being in the world, the idea of dwelling itself. And then that then becomes, it's a sadhana not for something else, but it's a sadhana of your life in itself, the idea of architecture as this act of dwelling. I think for me, what I find important about it is that, every time we kind of, the idea of performing, I think is slightly different. Performance in some ways imagines that there is an audience and you're doing it, unlike Riyaz, let's say, for somebody else. So there is that slight sort of movement. However, that somebody else might be yourself as well in the mirror. It may be somebody that you're performing for, somebody that you want to be. And that may not be a gaze that traditionally can be called an outsider's gaze. It's your own gaze as somebody else, if you're getting what I'm trying to say. So I think that the idea of Riyaz, I think, is an important one, because what Riyaz does is that it has an idea of some sort of perfection that we want to attain, whoever that perfection is for. It doesn't really matter whether it's myself or somebody else. Okay, an idea of my identity as an architect, let's say. And I think what happens is that for students especially, it's important for them to see whom they want to become. And then the kind of idea of riyaz then becomes deeply embedded in the way that they then kind of, let's say, address their work. What has happened within the digital is that that space within which that riyaz is being performed, okay, is deeply intertwined with both the analog and the digital. That sort of this intermingling exists, and that boundary is not one that is very clear, at least not to me. I'm not able to necessarily make that difference between, I mean, you know, as soon as this meeting is over, I'm going to kind of shut off and I'm going to go get my coffee. And that is almost impossible. I don't have any time in some ways to assimilate, perhaps, or maybe have too much time to assimilate. You know, there's nothing else to do, right? So I think that the relationships between the digital and the analog and the kind of intertwining of those, or the wave that has happened between them, has made the idea of kind of riyaz, it has transformed it in some way. It's for us to kind of find, if we are able to, and I really think it's really important to be very conscious of your space and when I'm saying space, I don't mean only the presence of me being without the digital, but my sense of being with the digital. Okay, just to kind of clarify that. And my sense of being as one that constitutes all these different identities that I have, all of them, and the ones that I choose to perform and then the one that I'm trying to choose to perform is that of being an architect. And I think one has to be able to kind of practice or do riyaz for that particular kind of identity with the complete knowledge of all the other identities one is actually navigating within. And that is really where the struggle happens, when your life and work are so deeply intertwined as they are now. But what Shubra is suggesting, what I find is an important one. I mean, Shubra, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that division itself is something that we have kind of learned from somewhere else. What has happened is that with our lives now being in these cycles and rhythms of maintaining, like you're using your word, constantly kind of maintaining ourselves in some sense, right? That division itself is kind of blurred. And that has changed the thinking machine of the architecture. We are starting to think about new ways of what is architecture itself and what modes of practice we can really imagine. So yeah, I think that I'll end there. I think let Shubra take over because she really has thought about this perhaps at a much greater length than I have. Yeah.
Actually, the thinking came because one just had to do, like when I was cleaning and sweeping and I mean, really, I was cleaning bathroom and this and that every bloody day. It was just bloody minded repetition, but it was no different from, you know, when as a kid one learned music, when one learned dance. I mean, now in retrospect, it was also fun. The fun part was before and after the class when you met your friends, etc. No, as kids. The actual part of it, for most times, you hardly learned anything new. You had to keep doing the same thing again and again, especially if it was a half-decent school or half-decent teacher. You would keep doing the sargam for like 3 months, yeah. And but through that, it is that when the record of that is important, first of all. So I think it was a friend of mine who was also a client who once, when his kid told him that, you know, Papa, I'm bored, rather than that Mad Men style saying only boring people get bored, he actually said, now that's where creativity will begin from. You have to allow yourself to get to sort of get so in tune with a certain monotony that becomes so part of yourself that something is discovered from within, rather than force the idea of new to enter in. And what I found Rohan's sort of the whole the hybrid, especially cyborg is one type of an hybrid, but not knowing your identity, a very, very curious condition of repetition, because and I'm just, because I heard his lecture just now, I may not be able to make a very fluid or a coherent argument, but the fact is that what I was trying to say here is, especially with the digital and the analog or whatever, either way, your practice has to be, the space of practice, mind space, physical space, material space, has to be one which allows you to leave traces of previous practice. That's sort of palimpsest, because it's, if you do yoga every day, the record is suddenly your body's changing. That's the record. It's not I want to get to a certain body type. It is my body's changing. I can experience that. I am experiencing the traces of practice. Okay? Drawing, it's the same thing. When you draw, if you leave traces of previous iterations before, then that drawing is a practice of itself. It's a practice to work with an idea. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say digital doesn't allow you to do that. But how do we keep a record of our practice in the digital media, perhaps, is a better question than whether the digital media allows us to keep a record or not. And maybe that's where I'd kind of throw it back to Rohan.
I think, you know, like for me, that idea of play that Derrida kind of really talks about, right? The idea that you play and you perform your identities through the act of playing. I actually think that is where this idea of an embodied, that playing becomes a sort of where you play the part. And as you're playing the part, it then becomes slowly, deeply part of your very capital B being, you know, and I think that is really an exciting one. I in fact think that the digital really becomes a place where we can really enable more of these sorts of plays, if you know what I mean, the game playing in some ways. And we haven't, I mean, quite frankly, I haven't figured out exactly how. It's something that we have to kind of think about.
Play is also very exciting as a method, because when you're playing, you are not intellectually, nobody plays intellectually. You play. Again, it's one of those things where you are required to be present. Otherwise, your fellow playmates will just look at you and say, you're not really sticking. You're not with it. We are going to go find someone else. Because you're not with it, you're too conscious about yourself and you're not present in the play, you are actually making the play fall apart. So in that sense, you can think about play, what you played later, but while you're in it, it requires you, again, like Riaz, to sort of be present. I mean, and that being present means all that you have thought about, reflected, etc., now has to go through you and come out in the context within which you're playing, whatever that is. So you're building. There you can't keep analyzing, you can't keep reflecting. There has to be that leap of faith into a projective, which is why it's both. Anyway, it's quite interesting as a sort of method.
We can open up the panel and ask if anybody has any questions. We can start discussing.
Kiran, I thought you had a third question. Kiran had a third question. I counted.
No, there's a 15-minute time, so I thought if to start and then maybe come back to the third question as a backup.
Kiran, we have not received any questions in the chat box yet. So,
Kiran, you're the third question.
That's the more pressure on the moderator. Rohan, you had used a sentence. I was very curious about that sentence. How do we create within the space of the studio the simulations of the real? I didn't think in terms of the digital. I was just thinking like real studios, right? When we are even in the offline semester, how do we simulate the real? I was just curious.
So they're simulations. First of all, I genuinely don't believe that a project that's given in the studio needs to replicate the real. There's no point in doing that, right? It's about what performance do we want the student to participate in, and a so-called reality is then constructed for them to perform a role in. That's the way that it's imagined, right? So it's very important to to be careful about that. Too often it happens that, people say that, oh, this project is unrealistic, or this, whatever.
Yeah.
There's all this sort of stuff that happens. The point is, that is not what a college is not meant to make buildings. A college is meant to train students who can then in the future make decisions concerning buildings. That's another world entirely, right? So I think in the way that one especially designs, let's say the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, whatever you want us to do, I think it's important to know that if Riyaz is going to be an important part of that, of what one is learning, if it's embodied, the idea of knowledge is something that's an embodied sort of being of an architect, then we need to design a studio where the student is asked to perform certain actions, simulations that may come from the outside or may not come from the outside, but a simulated kind of environment is created which creates certain conditions within which questions can be asked. That's about it. And within those questions, a student is then asked to make some decisions, because I think that is an important thing to say. What I mean is that too often I find that, especially I studied at Bombay University College of Architecture, and too often there were too many right answers given. Earlier, it was always imagined that there is one answer to a certain question. There is one plot, a certain program. The program has to interpret it in a certain way, and that's because of the way that we very often imagine architecture, this functionalist, efficient object that we are to be used, that we are to use. But that doesn't necessarily raise ethical questions or any other questions concerning the role that architecture is supposed to play in the world. So I think those questions, which can be seen as in many ways outside architecture, for some, I've seen this being asked, say pucho mat, ye architecture nahi hai. I've heard that very often, right? But to really talk about architecture is not something that is kind of only a building that is a result of different forms, and that might be in the world outside. But within the space of the studio, it's important to set value systems in the way that with a set of value systems within which the student is asked to come up with discoveries. This is an important sort of thing, and I don't think sometimes we are very conscious of that. At least in the schools that I have studied in, if nothing else. So that's why I think it's important for us to think about the value systems that we are embedding students with in every stage of the project, not just simply the tools and the skills that we are supposedly training them in. That's about it. Yeah. There's a question from Vijay. Sorry, Shubra.
Just a small sort of anecdote to that. This whole business of studio versus the real world, and how each one can feed and inform another. A very curious little exercise also happened. I mean, you can't make formulas of these, because it happened because the site was SEPT University and the students who were working on this project were also at the university. So in this particular unique situation, their site of inhabitation was also a site for their speculation, even though they were doing different parts. So parallel to their studio project became the exercise of critiquing and constantly creating spaces that accommodated and lent grace to the work they were doing at that point. What do I mean by that? Nowadays, the SEPT studios are no longer one class per that lovely studio space, right? Because of the population increase, etc. Each of those lovely studios that have been designed are now shared by 3 to 4 studios. And the space allocated to each studio is an accounting decision, space per square footage sort of a thing. Now we know, and the students quickly began to know, that different stages of the studio process, their learning process, requires them to need different amounts of space. And this happened to all their 4 studios. So the parallel thing became, as the module changed during the semester, they had to redesign their studio space and renegotiate their boundaries in live time with their other 3 studio mates, and then document all those decisions through drawings. Now, at no point could the tutor be involved, because no figures of authority. If their neighboring studio didn't agree, they had to figure out another design way to meet their brief, which was to create for themselves a good, graceful situation. So suddenly if they were making 1:20 models and they had a space which was barely like 10 feet or something, what are they going to do? What is the meaning of thresholds? What is the meaning of dependency, sharing, blah, blah, blah. Now, suddenly, there is no real and unreal. This is as real as it gets because it reflects the actual space they're inhabiting, and that's feeding back to the design conversations we are having at their studio project, but both are projects. And that's in a way, again, it's a way where the boundaries and distinctions are not there. You don't forget. Now, I don't know I've not had enough time. 1 year, I don't know how to have a similar equivalent exercise, let's say now, but that's okay. I'm not forcing it. If it comes, perhaps something will come out of it. But, you know, to me, studios are very real. To me, they are not finish learning and then you will go practice. Because, for instance, if I change a requirement midway in the semester, it is as traumatic as when the client comes and says, or when a city jurisdiction comes and says, hey, zoning says you can't do this. It's just as similar because it throws a wrench into your sort of steady progress of developing a design. So it's sort of the angst, the anxiety, the thrill, all that we all share.
Here's a question from Bijoy. He's asked me to read out. How do we include an awareness of all that is produced as part of the studio? The digital platforms don't give us the peripheral vision, the discovery of a discarded drawing, a bit of a model, and so on. Students and teachers are busy putting it together, the final presentations to perform with.
I find that actually some of these methods that we have online have become more and more adept at being able to archive stuff. That is one of the great things about the digital platform is that actually. So we've been trying to evolve these Miro boards, Instagram pages, these sorts of trying to use the infrastructure of the digital that already exists and trying to find new ways through which one can create collaborative sorts of spaces of learning. I think the Miro board really helps actually. A lot of the different things can come and go in there, and you can make charts and it's become more and more fluid and flexible, I think, especially over the past few months. I think they've upped their game quite a bit. That is a struggle, and it was a struggle for us when we started teaching. But I think now I'm getting used to it. Now, even for my theory lectures, it's quite an exciting thing I've tried. I've made a whole sort of, how should I call it? You know how those, like a map of ideas that exists on a Miro board, all of them are hyperlinked. So you can hyperlink into one and you can go into a video somewhere and come out. And it's quite a lot of fun, actually. I doubt anyone is going to go through all of that stuff, but it was fun for me to make, if nothing else. So anyway, I think, Vijay, it's a good point. I think there are some ways in which we are trying to evolve these new methods of communication. WhatsApp helps in a strange way, all of these sorts of things. But it can't replicate the studio, and I don't think we should even try to. I think we should just try and work with these new mediums and try and figure out the best way of doing it. I hope that. Shubra, you want to
again, a very interesting question, and something we are everyone I think is trying to sort of find one's own balance, because and this business of hyperlink is really interesting because there's an argument to be made on the other side that the internet, as we all know, is a rabbit hole. No, you can just keep tumbling down, and sometimes the argument becomes, how do you bring back the focus? Which sometimes when you're in a live studio, this is what there is for that studio session. So it's one of these strange things that you lose some in terms of what Vijay rightly said, because we always talk about storage in learning environments as something that is not a service space, so to speak, but it it is a served space in Khan's lexicon, because it is critical where you store your stuff to be in eye contact with that. So yes, in that sense, of course, the peripheral vision in a Zoom environment, in an environment like this, you are only seeing what I choose to show you. You don't know what's on the wall I'm facing, for instance. You only know what's behind me, in that sense. But at the same time, the opportunities in terms of multiple rabbit holes to open up your inquiry into areas that you never went in, to learn how to ask questions, because the internet spits back only the same quality of answers that your question is off. So if you ask a good question of the internet gives you a good answer. It's like those old research methods. How do you frame the question? So the importance of asking relevant questions, articulating your inquiry, focusing on that, has opened up in ways that I won't hang on to, actually. So in a sense, Bijoy's question has left me with a question that, so what would I want to hang on to if or when the world goes back to, as in the government mandates, no more online, everything is on campus? What parts of these 20 months would I want to actually hang on to or carry forward? So thank you, Bijoy, for that question, because rather than drop, which things will I drop? Which ones will I want to hang on to becomes a little more interesting.
Yeah, there's a question from Tushara. Tushara, you want to ask the question, or shall I read it?
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. So thanks for the wonderful session, Rohan and Shubra. So this is like rather, I mean, I think there were a lot of perspectives that you were bringing into the discussion, where, I mean, every one of us were trying out to adapt through the situation, no? So one was wondering, like, if, I mean, what if this pauses are, I mean, kind of it became very often, and actually we are actually in the second year of this pause, and no more, I don't know whether we can call it as a pause also. So maybe like in this different forms, it is actually shaking the conventional pedagogical envelopes, for us. So what could be the mode of framework where the complexity of the context and the other realities could also be brought in for the students, like to gradually grappling through those questions also, probably from start. I mean, like Rohan was pointing out in the discussion. So first time we started with the neighborhood level, and I think few of us were even grappling the questions on a city level. But I think how we can, if the 5 years, like, or probably the 2 years of the entire course, they are learning remotely, I think we are also trying to understand, like, what could be the kind of adaptation through this, bringing in the complexity also through kind of framework or maybe operation. Any reflections?
Well, it's something that we're also struggling with, actually, because we do realize that although the online does allow you to do some things, there are some things that you cannot do, and vice versa. Right? So what we are planning to do is be as agile as possible. That's the only way that we can do this. Right? Be very agile about being very flexible and being very, अच्छा, अभी opportunity मिला ना, जल्दी कर लेते, यहाँ कर लेते, trying to find ways in which we are able to, for example, we've seen where students are across the country, and we have made them into smaller groups so that they are going to certain places and they are doing things, so we are trying to kind of figure things out, but there is no easy answer to that question. I mean, at one level, there are certain things that you learn physically, like the riding of a bicycle. You cannot do that by looking at the internet very much. And you have to get onto the damn bicycle, right? So, what to do? So there are some things like we'll have to find ways so that their bodies and their minds can perform those actions together. Even if that's an argument and a discussion or a cup of coffee or gossip, right? These are important things about learning that we very often don't pay attention to in the online format. We're usually focused on the on the pedagogy, but really most of the learning frankly happens because senior ne bola, junior ne bola, it happens because I'm in love with the girl next door or the boy next door, it happens because of things like that. All of these things don't happen. It's really kind of scary. Like, for example, my current first year that has come into the school has never seen, forget each other, they have never seen the work that has happened by anyone else. So they are completely with a blank slate. Now that is in some ways a good thing, but it's also some ways a difficult thing because there's no parameters against which they can even see what their work is like, right? And you can talk as much as you want to, but at the end of it, they have no friends who are telling them, "Kya faltugiri kar raha hai tu?" Or "Tu ye dekh." And so there's spaces that open up, or the times that open up outside the conventional classroom, outside the conventional screen, okay, that we kind of do. Those have not been able. Those we have not been able to break. Though we are trying to evolve informal zones of that. The classroom format is itself broken out into. They had the dance party online, and they did these sorts of strange things. Okay, I'm hoping that maybe some romances might happen online, because that'll help. But so that's it. That's all I can say is that I think just agility and the ability to see an opportunity within the constraints that we are all living under, to be able to find the ways of doing what we think is important.
It's really interesting. It's so true when you use the word agility. When I sort of when I was listening to your question that you asked, Tushara, it makes me think that we are actually, it's so fortunate, we are living the condition that Deleuze and Guattari were talking about. We are living in an age of tactics rather than strategies, because we don't know what's, the response time is so little, and the unknowns are so many, and our resources are fairly limited, that this making do, it may not seem intellectually great, but I think that every once in a while, if we reflect on the previous months or previous semesters making do, you begin to realize a fair amount of accomplishment, in a sense, because again, we didn't know what the outcome was going to be at the end of the semester. We still don't know. I mean, yeah, people try and pin us down, but it's like you begin with, let's say, an online mode, then everything goes offline, then again everything goes online. All this can still happen. And so this learning to believe in what we all read and felt so excited about, learning to now live it, which is one step after another. And with each step, if a pebble comes, to relocate your step, you didn't know the pebble was there. It's that we are all living. And so that is the answer as well as the question for right now. And in some ways that's exciting. We rarely get to live the philosophies we learn about. They always seem to be out there in the field for someone else and coming to us as observations and intellectual sort of writings. So in that sense, yeah, nimble, adaptable, agile, improvised, all of that. And in that sense also, one begins to critique one's own self now, how implicated we are in the state, as we like to call it. We are all so part of the system, because if we already lived a life of improvisation and tactical lives, this wouldn't be a problem. It would just be the mode of engagement. No? So it's one of these things where the situation is itself this glorious opportunity to self-critique, self-realize, but we can't sit here and say what that is going to actuate. Yeah.
Thank you, Rohan and
Shubra. We'll take one more question. We close to 4. Shubra, a question to you.
Oh, I can read it.
Totally, yeah.
Krishna, but if she's here, maybe she can ask. Krishna, hi, Krishna.
Hi, Shubra. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Hi, Rohan.
Thanks.
Yeah, so
Hi.
my question was to Shubra. It's totally out of curiosity and the way you talk with, using your hands a lot and expression. My concentration was totally going to your screen while you're presenting also. So how
I'm so sorry.
No,
Nice.
I am a little distracted probably. I mean, when you were showing like that, I totally was going with that. Okay. My question is, how much of your expertise in drama has been used in architecture practice or teaching, if at all it is interlinked?
Krishna, actually, I have no expertise. I only have interest.
Okay.
In the sense that, okay, you do school dramas and things, but other than that, I'm terrifically interested both in cinema, but also live theater. Just because of the liveness of it, I think. But in general, I feel greatest sort of inputs that help me grow come from outside of architecture, really. Because they become those, again, the way then my familiar is questioned constantly, by people who are not architects. And yeah, I do work though a lot with, obviously because I'm interested in theater and so I work with a lot of theater makers. I'm very intrigued by both theater makers and storytellers. Apparently they're two different disciplines. But that's it, because I'll give you an example which caught my eye. My sister, who's also a storyteller by way of anthropology, once was talking to a group of landscape students, I think, or a workshop, I don't remember, where she was saying that for a storyteller, the sense of the land and what the body inhabits is just as important as architects and, let's say, theater makers, because they occupy space as well. And she said a simple story like Red Riding Hood, for instance, if your story is based in Germany and near the Rhine and the Black Forest, full of shadows and moss and moisture, the way you would sort of begin to unfold in your telling the journey Red Riding Hood took to the heart of the forest to visit her grandma would be maybe of silences and shadows and, the landscape, and your familiarity with it will point how the story unfolds and how you tell it, versus, let's say, if it was located in Bastar and the jungles beyond that, full of like every deer step results in a crack, and it's dry and there's just completely different sounds. So that acuity with which you need to know the landscape is something we share across disciplines. But being introduced that way perhaps releases some juices in your head, in terms of, okay, because I think of landscape in terms of topography, my survey map, at the most, the idea of water receding and, like Himanshu and Deepta talked about, in terms of difficult to pin down the edge of a water, but it's very physical. It's from things I know. And to be introduced to this very same things from another position and point of view enriches my comprehension of what it is that I'm looking at as well. So not expertise, just interest, and then surrounding. I'm sure Rohan has a similar set of experiences with film and cinema and everything that goes with that. So.
Yeah, even though I've made 2 films, I never consider myself an expert in filmmaking. I have my partner who's actually trained as a filmmaker. I just have an incredible interest in art, literature, and film. I'm interested in culture generally, and seeing architecture very much as part of that, part of the ways in which we as people try and make sense of the world. And I see architecture as also just another way in which we are trying to make our place, in other words. And in architecture, that place is really the place. But in narrative as well, in stories that we tell each other, we are also in many ways trying to place ourselves in. But I think there is a There's a lot to learn that kind of runs across disciplines, not only about the way that we imagine our place in the world, but also questions of form itself, of questions of beauty. All of these things are incredible kinds of things that one can learn from cinema, from visual art, from sculpture, from poetry. So I love everything. I am a little, how should I put it, promiscuous when it comes to music and movies. I watch everything from Marvel to Tarkovsky, a film a day, So, and I play my music on shuffle, which goes from, I guess, Beethoven to Britney Spears. So it's great to have that sense, to be generous with the ways in which one sees the world. Each of them, Britney Spears or Bach, has a way in which they're seeing the world. And I think it's amazing to kind of engage with all of these and enjoy them and learn from them. You may not learn kind of things explicitly, but there are things about the world that you do understand from all these different things. So I always recommend to my students at least, "Arey, kuch bhi dekh lo, lekin dekho. Kuch bhi sun lo, lekin suno." There's no use in being too puritanical about things. I think it's a waste of energy.
Yes. Thank you, Rohan and Shubra.
On that note, maybe we can conclude this session to catch up a gap between the next session. Thanks, Rohan and Shubra, for the wonderful talk. A lot to soak in, and I think maybe questions are emerging slowly. Maybe they can write to you or something. But thanks for the wonderful session, and thanks
Kiran, for that wonderful set of moderation, and thank you, Avani. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. It was wonderful to.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, Rohan.
Thank you, Kiran.
Now for my coffee.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, Kiran.
Thank you, Kiran.
Thank you. Bye.